Welcome to another episode of Corporate CPR, where we breathe life back into your organization, projects, and processes, giving you insights to recovery and avoiding corporate mortality events. Joining us today is Shashi Kiran. Shashi is the Chief Marketing Officer at Aryaka Networks. He's responsible for Aryaka's global marketing, product management, and technology partnership. He brings over 20 years of experience in the high-tech industry across marketing, product management, business development, and partnerships. Welcome, Shashi. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thank you for having me, Jana.
Yeah. Do you want to share anything else about your background before we get started?
No, I think you covered it well. Let's get right into it.
All right. Well, so today we're talking about the technology challenges within the working with a hybrid workforce, and obviously a lot more companies are having to take this on, and probably we probably say it's probably even a trend that will continue somewhat into the future. So. What are some of the things that companies need to, think about first when they're trying to think about a sustainable hybrid workforce?
Yeah, we talk to a lot of business leaders in the course of our own day-to-day jobs, and most of the CIOs and CEOs that I speak with, certainly they're all mandated to drive growth, which is top of mind for them, their boards, and things like that. At the same time, they're all dealing with a tremendous amount of change. If you look at the impact that the pandemic has had over the last 18 to 24 months now, and now this week we have this new Omicron variant that's popping up. All of that is, really driving the way that people think about their businesses to be very different from how they were 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
You've had large corporations, the Facebooks, the Googles, even saying, "Look, let my entire workforce go remote," right? And they've all made good investments in their headquarters, in their real estate locations across the portfolio, and suddenly they've had to accommodate the workforce working from home with perhaps a subpar internet connection. And look at this around the world. You don't have the kind of connectivity that we sort of enjoy here in the US, the predictability and things like that. So it creates for a very different kind of workforce. Some companies are saying, maybe I don't need this real estate footprint. Let my employees be remote 100%. Others are looking to consolidate, move to other locations. And so when you dial this back up to what the CEOs are mandated to do, they have to drive growth in this tremendous amount of uncertainty, when everything is in flux, and at the same time make sure that their employees are productive, make sure that they are collaborative. And to do that in the old world scenario is not an easy thing, right? You just can't enable a video conferencing session and say, hey, your collaboration is turned on, you're all good to go, right? It's really about changing the workflows for the workforce. It's changing about the experience that they have, and making sure that organizations are still purpose driven, and they're all leaning on technology to make it happen. At the end of the
Mm-hmm.
day, as much as it is a human driven cultural scenario, they are viewing technology platforms that can help them navigate this space of change that's coming at them and to them. So that's where the whole notion of this hybrid workplace comes into the play, which means, in a nutshell, regardless of where your employee is, regardless of whether you have a location for them to work or not, can you continue to make them highly productive, efficient, accountable, motivated, and enjoy that experience, right? So that's where we're looking at how does technology and architectural investments that enterprises can make go and facilitate in making this a reality.
When you talk about though, organizations, you can't just give them the tools and then expect the same effectiveness of meetings that they used to have, right? What are the kind of things that people need to be doing from a change management perspective to actually help facilitate productivity and not lose, because you do lose something when you're not co-located. I mean, that's why agile principles are all based on co-location, or I should say Scrum principles. So what are your thoughts around the change management there?
I think a lot of it has to do today, the way we collaborate is through applications, right? Even sitting in the same office, sometimes we are all accessing applications that are in the cloud. And to be able to deliver on that kind of application experience in a consistent way, regardless of where somebody is physically located, is actually one of the big states of nirvana, right? And to be able to do it in a cost-effective manner, and as more organization move towards cloud first approaches, can you sort of embrace that across the rest of the organization in everything that you do? I mean, there are areas that technology can help with, and there are areas technology cannot. And the whole idea here is, how do you make the organization more nimble enough so that it can accommodate change? And to do that, what we are seeing is, as organizations modernize, move their applications to the cloud, is your infrastructure equally nimble, or is your infrastructure a bottleneck? And is your network, your wide area, a hindrance, or is it an enabler? Is your security posture going to be the same, or is it going to change, right? Because we all know the kind of security policies that were enforced when you're all congregated in a particular location. Security in the mobile context is different, and security when you start to go spawn out in different locations working from home. How do you administer all of these policies, make sure you have access to these applications, make sure they're getting the same degree of experience? I mean, that's one way in which organizations can empower their employees and workforce. And you have to be able to do that without cost stacking. And what I mean by that is, you can't go duplicate infrastructure everywhere
Hmm.
and build up this huge capacity, so that at some point, sooner than later, it's going to hurt your bottom line, right? How do you make sure that you're able to accommodate the needs of the employees without necessarily creating these parallel siloed infrastructural elements, which becomes an overhead to maintain, and change management becomes difficult? So that's where we're looking at, how do you make sure you have an architecture that's flexible enough to accommodate these needs without necessarily setting up three different types of infrastructure to meet these different use cases. And that by itself is a good problem, a technology and an architectural problem to solve.
And so, what are some of the components of those solutions that organizations would be considering then as they embark on this journey?
Yeah, I think many organizations, even within the US, that we see, either for tax purposes or M&A situations, or just because their employees want it that way, they're moving their headquarters. They're enabling them to kind of work from home. So that's certainly one trend that's happening big time. And as I said, this is happening globally. And you no longer have even people to go do a truck roll into certain office locations, make sure the many data centers they had there is up and functioning, because that individual also obviously has made a move. So how do you sort of going back to what I said earlier, bring this into more of a cloud delivered approach, and make it easy for those change elements to happen in a graceful, non-disruptive manner? So that's something that we're seeing happen big time. And that's also where we see this convergence of network and security coming about, because these two were again a bit siloed before. And now, as applications move to the cloud, you suddenly find yourself hostage to a network that is legacy, which is more of this box stacking approach. You find yourself hostage to certain security architectures that were meant for when everything was centralized and not distributed. So those are all things that are changing in terms of how people are looking at evolving their architectures to be much more cloud centric and nimble.
And how do you start though? Do you even at the basics of like connectivity, which is, I guess, usually not something a company controls because it's dependent on the country's infrastructure. Because even among first world countries, it's disparate. Let alone if you start bringing in emerging countries, like obviously we work on a lot of international projects, and even Australia's connectivity isn't as strong as the U.S. And then you go to someplace like Pakistan and India, we've had a lot of challenges with the team dropping off or not being able to connect. And I actually remember even one time, and we had a team in South Africa, and they would have to drive to the office to connect and get there because the
Yeah,
connectivity to their homes wasn't great. So, how do you, that's a global challenge.
it is. And it's like, you going in search of the perfect cell phone signal because your voice quality is dropping, and then you walk 10 feet away and say, is this better, right?
Mm.
It's somewhat like that right now. If you look at it, it's not just the locations that have shifted, but suddenly you have video being such a vast amount of traffic, and bandwidth is a bit of a premium in many countries around the world. And then voice is very latency sensitive, so you want to make sure that no matter where you are, and not everybody has the luxury of being able to get on a broadband. Many of them, connect into even our corporate environments through their cell phones.
Mhm.
And so I think in this context, being able to sort of normalize it by taking the network as close as possible to where it is being consumed, the user, whether the user is a branch office location, whether the user is a mobile endpoint, whether it's a laptop with voice or IP. I think it doesn't matter. You have to be in a position to take the quality of the network as closely as possible to the consumption point, and make sure that this wide area network with all of the speed bumps it has is actually able to deliver a land like experience as if it's in a local network. And that's a hard thing to do, but that's where companies such as ourselves kind of step in, because we have built out a global network. We've built out a very highly predictable highway of sorts globally that delivers very predictable application performance. And some of the things that we're on the cusp of announcing is really making that more available to the masses. And so loosely you can think of in the United States, you have the concept of HOV lanes, and then you have the non-HOV lanes, right? So we've always had this network that was a HOV network, which meant traffic flow was much more predictable, and obviously it's a bit premier, but you get from point A to point B in a very predictable way. And we were managing that as well with security and with the network being delivered as a service, like it's a cloud delivered service. Now we're on the cusp of sort of extending into the other non-HOV lanes as well, and bringing them into the fold, and allowing for people to go from one to other in a very simple way, so they can change lanes and accommodate the needs of the business. Because as I said, business environment is changing so quickly. If you're in a certain lane and you feel the need to go to either the HOV lane, or you feel that you don't want to do that, your sites are less strategic, maybe it's a warehouse that you need to connect to that isn't latency sensitive, right? Then you go back into the non-HOV lane. So that kind of flexibility that we're in a position to provide at a network level, and then have the security also tag along with it, is, in our opinion, going to help a lot of our customers make that transition and decision making easy when they have to deal with all of these ad moves and changes.
So you've brought up security a couple of times, and one of the things that I think is challenging with security is it's a balancing act between keeping your organization secure, but also being able to get work done without people having to pull their hair out. And I've seen a little bit as well where company or people are able to work anywhere in the world now with these remote policies, but a lot of organizations have their network shut down to other countries. So, for instance, like, when I travel to Australia, we have clients here that I can't get into their network, um, because they have it blocked off to anybody but the US. So, do you think that's going to be going to change, or do you think? And how do companies still stay safe if they have to open up, to more parts of the world?
Yeah, in security, if you speak about it simplistically, you can either blacklist somebody by default or you can whitelist somebody by default, right? And which is the implicit deny versus implicit allow, or explicit deny and allow. And I think right now, because of the way that people are changing at the edge so quickly, uh, an organization needs to be able to establish certain boundaries of trust before they are in a position to explicitly allow. And that trust, it takes time, it takes certain criteria to be able to cross that threshold where you're saying, hey, I'm going to allow this entity. And that's where you see this notion of zero trust becoming so prominent and popular now. In the last 18 months, that's become such a big terminology. It was always there in some sense, but it's become top of mind, because you have to figure out whom can you trust, for them to be allowed into accessing the network. So we're going to see more of that. And I think those mechanisms to expedite trust will become faster, right? And everything comes from a cost of business. And you see, first thing is to protect and secure, next is to figure out whom do you want to allow. And a lot of these now are becoming automated in terms of how you establish the trust boundaries. And that's where the policy definition also comes into play. Because if you look at the model a decade ago, a lot of it was box by box configuration, whether it be for network or whether it be for security. And the thing with something like that is 80%, 90% of security errors are really due to misconfigurations and inadvertent manual errors. And so you sort of start to minimize a lot of that when you don't need to do this box by box command level configuration. And that's where the software defined nature of networks and security have allowed a degree of abstraction, and centralization, automation, and validation, and things like that. So it is possible to scale these in a much more faster way without compromising the quality and reducing risk. So we're seeing a lot of these come about. The challenge, Jana, is that the security stack is so complicated, right? And it's very naive to assume that you're living in an environment where everything is greenfield and all the security policies can be defined from scratch. In reality, it's a world of spaghetti. Especially you look at larger enterprises, they've actually made investments for decades. And in some cases, security policies have been put together by somebody who's no longer in the organization, and they don't want to touch it. They don't want to touch it. So you kind of build upon this spaghetti over a period of time. And it unless they transition to a different architecture altogether, uh, it's going to be hard for them to manage that spaghetti. And that's the world that we live in. So you have to sort of create these entry points and exit points where you say, look, this is a known known for me, this is a known unknown, this is a unknown known, and this is an unknown unknown. And so each one comes with a different kind of risk profile, and the way you treat it is also going to be different. And today, fortunately, we have different vendors addressing the different aspects of the stack, but it is converging. It's starting to converge. You're seeing some of these mergers and acquisitions happen as a result of that. If I look at Aryaka, the company where I work for, we were always this best-in-class network as a service company, this global network, great managed experience. We rate highly on Gartner and things like that. We were not a security company, but we see these two getting intertwined very quickly. And so earlier this year, we made an acquisition of a company in Germany called SecureCloud. And we have now brought in some of these features into our own cloud like POPs. And we're now getting ready to be able to deliver them as a converged service between network and network security. So for some organizations that want to move away from the old model, they want to change to these architectures, things that somebody like Gartner has christened as SASE, Secure Access Service Edge. It gives them a choice. It gives them ability to go to an architecture that they feel is more conducive for managing change. And in that case, the network and security postures are tied together at the hip. And so those are things that are underway, but it is still a very complicated world. And I think we have to deal with deployments on premise, deployments in one cloud, deployments in multi-cloud environments. And as you can imagine, each public cloud also has its own kind of security and stack posture. So I think it's a very interesting job, sort of weaving all of these things together and making sure that, going back to what we said earlier, the user experience, application experience, and the security elements are not really compromised.
You're talking about like all this investment that companies are going to end up needing to make to be able to support the hybrid. And obviously they've probably got a lot of patchwork things at the moment, and they're going to need to stabilize on their technology. But I'm thinking now ahead, maybe 10 years from now, when maybe the metaverse becomes a thing, and maybe we're working in these virtual office in the metaverse, where we all have to, wear our VR headsets. In some ways, it'll help collaboration, because you could still write on the board. You could still have offices where you could go visit people's offices. But I mean, I guess there's so many things we could talk about there. But one, how do companies prepare for that change? And are we going to create now even more disparity against people, like organizations and countries that can afford those investments versus maybe ones who can't?
I think that's a very interesting outlook. And in a way, it's becoming a reality today. I look at my own household. 10 years ago, we had probably 2 laptops and 2 cell phones. Yesterday, as I was looking at our own house Wi-Fi, there were 43 devices connected to it, and that's with just the 4 of us. So if you can do that in one household of 4, especially when you get into the metaverse, it's going to be this huge explosion, right? All the things that we've talked about, IoT, it's going to be a IoT times exponential, right? And you're getting used to, and there's also already talk of Apple maybe phasing away their iPhones in 10 years, because they are preparing for this world of augmented reality where you don't need phones anymore. And that was the heading I saw yesterday in a article. And so people are preparing for that kind of a world. And when you see somebody like Facebook say, look, all the brand equity that I've built in, whether positive or negative, with the name Facebook, I'm willing to relinquish that and go with a meta name. That means that trend suddenly starts to become real, and now, here and now. And I think once you have the Facebooks, the Googles, the Amazon driving that kind of change, those are massive levers. You're going to see that change happen very, very quickly. And I think the office of the future is not us going to be sitting in front of a computer screen looking at ourselves, but rather maybe wearing these VR headsets and really being next to each other in a room, right? That's sort of the next degree of collaboration, and what a hybrid workplace would look like.
Well, and I feel like you gain a lot of what you've lost leaving the workplace. So, we do technology project management, and there are times where maybe you're about to go live with something, and it would be really good to sit next to a user and walk them through how to use the new solution. Or if you're trying to whiteboard, how are we going to deliver this project? And while you can do some of that on screen share, you lose some of the energy, I guess, by being on, a Zoom meeting or something like that. Whereas I think if we could be in this metaverse, an office in the metaverse, we've recaptured what we lost.
I think so. I mean, there are positives and negatives to everything. And for me, balance is important. Today, if I look at my own kids, the amount of time they spend in front of the screens is 100 times of what I did, right? Maybe more. And sometimes I feel it's an advantage because they're getting this learning. Didn't have to compromise on education when schools were shut down. But other times, almost everything they end up doing is through that portal. And you have to balance it with the ability to have real world connections, right? I'm sure these AR, VR headsets will evolve and all of that, but you're sort of going back to that science fiction movie when everybody is wearing this headset, and you don't want to become like that. So I think there will be certain use cases that will be important where the positives vastly outweigh the negatives. And there may be other cases where you don't want it to just be the default mode of communication for everything,
Mm.
which reduces the human level of engagement. And that's the balancing act that many companies that are exploring technology in these areas need to be very cognizant of, to make sure it inadvertently doesn't lead to some of this addictive behavior. And there are certain schools where they've done studies about the harmful effects of lack of social interaction because everybody is now in an atomic unit of one, right? And so those are things I think we need to look at. But I do envision the workplace of 10 years from now being vastly different from what it is today. And as they always say, work is not where you go, it's what you do. And
Yeah.
so that changes a lot.
Well, we just might need to be intentional about other ways of connecting. I think about, so I was homeschooled for part of my education, and there's you create ways to connect. It's just now more, I think, in your community, or for me, it was going to work at the fast food restaurant, but there were you can build relationships that way. Or I think about like my daughter, who's always gone to schools that aren't close to her house.
Yeah.
And so she builds her friendships more in the neighborhood than friendships at school. I mean, she has friendships at school, just, but that human interaction then comes from the neighborhood. And I just wonder if, we'll be doing more community happy hours or something if all of work is in some sort of remote setup.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of the premise of the Matrix. If you watch
Mm-hmm.
that movie, there is a reality within a reality, and everything is an illusion. So those are some of the fun things to anticipate, and perhaps unintended consequences we'll need to watch out for. But if I look at the here and now, I do think the gateway to making a lot of those happen is through having the right kind of infrastructure, because eventually they're all modes of communication. And you need to have something that provides predictable communication, secure
Mm-hmm.
communication. And so I don't think these careabouts will go away. They will just manifest themselves in a different way. And
Mm-hmm.
I think you're going to already start seeing some of that with 5G at the edge, because it's giving a lot of bandwidth and the ability to bypass the need for a traditional on-premises device. If a lot of endpoints can get to the cloud through 5G with that high quality, right? So some of the things that we are solving as problems for today, those problems could be entirely bypassed. Here in the US, we're struggling with traditional broadband infrastructure, but in some of the emerging countries which didn't have that internet connectivity, they bypassed it when you went with the wireless revolution, because they could now set up these networks so quickly and catch up to what was a first world network. And I think we'll see these leapfrogs of technology happen with something new, where a country that or a company that is in catch up mode is suddenly able to leapfrog an incumbent because the technology allows them to do that.
Yeah, they aren't having to maybe migrate a whole bunch of stuff and
Exactly.
sunset systems
They don't need to deal
and
with the spaghetti. Yeah.
yeah, no, that's really interesting. I guess then, what would you say like the top three things that companies need to be focused on when it comes to this over the next 2 years?
I think a lot of it has to do with investments that they feel will give them flexibility, right? Because you don't know what the world is going to end up even coming out of the pandemic, right? There's so many of these decisions that are on hold or A lot of contracts that are, for example, in abeyance because they're just in a pause mode right now. And so the next degree of investments that people make will be more aligned with things that allow them to deliver a better experience. And for this, you'll see them investing a lot more in things that have an automated service experience with customers, artificial and intelligence based software, machine learning. These are all things that are going into almost every product that's coming out there by default. And I think that is just going to be driving a lot of new investments because it's touching across every aspect of the workflow, whether it's hiring employees, retaining employees, engaging with customers, troubleshooting. So I think that's going to be one big wave. Then we talked about the network piece. I think the investments in networks and cloud infrastructure is going to continue to go pretty big time. And obviously, de-risking it. We see all of these ransomware attacks and things like that come about. It's just the attack surface has become so large right now and so porous, and you don't know where things are. So there's just going to be a lot of attention being paid to that in terms of how do I, de-risk my business. Which points of when we talked about the unknown unknowns, this is what terrifies a lot of CIOs and CISOs. They can control what they know is a known unknown, but if it's an unknown unknown, that's really something hard to control. So I feel a lot of the investments will go into making some of these more visible and really be able to control, because everybody now wants to control their destiny, right? And control what you can control. So these are some 3 or 4 big areas that we will see investments in. Software with AI, cloud for sure is going to continue to go gangbusters. I see multi-cloud being another trend, because now today it's easier to get into a public cloud. It's very hard to get out of it or very expensive to get out of it. How do you minimize costs? So there's going to be a lot of focused on efficiencies. um, I would say the last decade was more about getting to the cloud and making sure you're able to have a faster time to market, right? Agility was top of mind. Now I think cost is going to be equally important, which is where efficiencies will come into play. So those are some dynamics that I see on the horizon.
That's great. Well, Shashi, if folks wanted to find more about you or your company, where's the best place for them to go?
Well, Jan, I would encourage them to look at our website. It's www.aryaka.com. It's ARYAKA.com. And I think you'll find that website to be hopefully interesting and useful for whatever you want to do.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being a guest today.
I appreciate you having me on.
And to everyone, to our listeners, until next time, keep your organizations healthy.